welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share stories about an obscure cryptid that is often mistaken for a Wendigo, and that is the Wechuge. The confusion between these two cryptids comes from a movie where a Wendigo was depicted as having a skull for a face, antlers, and an appearance identical to that of a Wechuge rather than what they really look like. While these two cryptids do share similarities, being that they are both cannibalistic, vengeful spirits, the Wechuge is a legend stemming from the Athabascan people. In Danazaa mythology, it is said to be a person who is possessed or overwhelmed by the power of one of the ancient giant spirit animals. These giant animals were crafty, intelligent, and powerful. Wechuges are said to be man-eating creatures that are anywhere from 12 to 15 feet in height or taller, usually bulky but can be lean or even described as lanky, have antlers and usually fur, or at least patches of it, and a skull for a face and head that resembles a deer, moose, or the like. Now that we know the story behind the Wechuge, we can move on to the stories of this episode. They include a young woman who saw something straight out of a nightmare outside her home one night, and a young man who saw a hulking silhouette on his mother's property. But first we start with one of the best stories I've come across in a while involving a creature looking into the windows of a cabin at a summer camp. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who had a scary encounter with a strange creature while at summer camp. The original poster lives in Canada, and the summer camp he attended was on Wabamun Lake in Alberta, Canada. Wabamun Lake is located in central Alberta in Parkland County. The lake is 65 kilometers or 40 miles west of Edmonton, covers 82 square kilometers or 32 square miles, and is 11 meters or 36 feet at its deepest. Its name is derived from the Cree word for mirror and is reputedly the best whitefish lake in the Edmonton area. The camp, as described by the OP, had separate small cabins set up for its older campers, and when the OP was 13 years old, he stayed in one of these cabins. There were 127 steps leading up to the area where the cabin stood. The OP knows this because he, along with the other campers, were made to count the steps. Once you made it up the steps, these cabins sat to the left with one staff cabin to the right of a clearing. To the right of the area were trails that led to other places at the camp. He gives a detailed layout of the cabins as this plays a part in the story. Upon entering one of the cabins via the front door at the front end, which had a window on either side of it, there were 3 bunk beds on the left and 2 to the right. The 3 on the left sat perpendicular with the heads of the beds resting against the wall and the foot of the beds toward the center of the cabin. The 2 sets of bunks on the right ran parallel to the wall they sat against. Along with the windows on either side of the door, there was one in the center of each wall between the beds and one at the back of the cabin. The windows were covered by curtains that didn't quite cover the entire window, leaving 4 to 8 inches uncovered on both sides of the curtain. These windows were at least 9 to 10 feet off the ground, being that the cabin sat on 3 to 3.5 foot stilts. The OP was sleeping on the top bunk of the first set on the left when entering the cabin. After unpacking their belongings, they headed out for the first day of camp. When they returned to the cabin that night, that's when weird things began to happen. The boys got in bed and started horsing around as 13 and 14-year-olds normally do. The OP had his flashlight out and was pointing it toward one of the boys on the right side of the cabin next to the window. As he was doing so, he noticed in the gap left by the curtain something white reflecting the light near the top of the window. By the time he realized what he had seen and looked back at the window, whatever was there darted away, retreating from the cabin. The OP says a primal sense of dread came over him in that moment that overwhelmed him to the point that he lost it, freaking out like what you would expect a 13-year-old to do. Meanwhile, another of the boys saw something at the top of the back window of the cabin and started freaking out as well. When the 2 boys calmed down, they both described the same exact thing to their cabin mates when asked what they saw. The OP says what freaked him out the most, and still does to this day, is whatever he saw peering in the window was at the top of the window, which was 9 or 10 feet off the ground, meaning this thing was at least as tall as the windows. They did not see anything for the rest of the night. The next night, some of the other guys, who thought the OP and the other boy were just messing with them, convinced them to go outside to see if they saw the supposed creature. This of course terrified the OP and the other boy who saw the thing the previous night. So the boys all ventured outside with their flashlights in hand and started walking down a trail near the cabin. They got about 60 feet down the trail when 4 of the boys, the OP included, saw a figure behind a tree about 150 feet in front of them. He describes what he saw as being pale and extremely lanky, with what looked like antlers on top of its head. The creature moved out from behind the tree and walked to the OP's left, angling away from them, moving with excruciating speed and with absolutely no sound whatsoever. He noticed that it had no visible hair. The 4 boys who saw this thing took off running as fast as they could back to the cabin. Once everyone was back inside, they locked the door and jumped in their beds, all of them freaking out, with some of them crying. One of the counselors came to check on them and asked why they were being so loud. They told him what they saw, but he did not believe them and thought they were just messing with him. He told them to go to bed and to stop being so loud before returning to his cabin. The OP did not see the creature again that night, but some of the other boys did and had the same reaction as the OP and his cabin mate the previous evening. The 3rd day and night went by without incident, but on the 4th night is when activity picked back up. The boys started hearing screaming in the woods, and after about 30 minutes, the OP and the boy in the bunk beside his both saw the creature peering into the window on the right side of the cabin. No one moved from their beds, and no one dared go outside or to the window to check things out. Not long after, they heard their counselor leave his cabin and look around outside, perceivably for them, before he came and looked in their cabin. Upon noticing they were all there and awake, his face shifted from anger to terror in a split second. He told the boys to lock the door before he sprinted back to his cabin and did the same. The next morning, they found scratches on their door to their cabin and also on the door to the counselor's cabin. The OP says he found this especially strange because he didn't sleep but about 2 hours that night, if that. He ends his post by asking if anyone reading his story knows what this thing could have been. He says he has tried very hard to find an explanation for what the creature could have been, but has come up with nothing. When venturing a guess, he says Fleshgate, Skinwalker, and Wendigo. I'm not so sure as an adult I wouldn't react the same exact way these boys did when seeing a creature looking into their cabin. And to be in a place surrounded by woods? That was probably a very long week for those boys without much sleep. It seems to me it was more curious than anything though, as it never acted aggressively toward them, especially when they went out into the woods that one night. The scratches on the doors of the boys' cabin and the counselor's cabin is definitely bizarre. Seems like it definitely wanted them to know it was there. As for what this thing was, I will throw out the name of another cryptid here, one that is lesser known and is almost always mistaken for and or misidentified as a Wendigo, and that would be a Wechuge. None of the creatures he mentioned have antlers, but a Wechuge does. I will say though that a Fleshgate or Goatman does have horns, but in his description of this being he says it looked like it had antlers. There is a pretty distinct difference between antlers and horns. Plus there is the height of this creature. For its eye to be at the top of a 9 or 10 foot window would mean that this thing was much taller than that, especially if it was crouching down to look inside. This would fit with the size of a Wechuge. What do you think this creature was, and what would you do if you saw a creature like this peeking in your window at night? The next story comes from a poster who had a terrifying experience one night at her home. It left her so shaken up that she was unable to sleep, so she posted her story right after it happened, with the hope that someone could tell her what she saw. She originally posted her story in a Wendigo forum, but I believe she saw something completely different that night. She does not say where her story takes place. Her story begins in her home at around 2 o'clock in the morning. Her dog, a German Shepherd, started barking very viciously at the front door. She mentions that her dog is a guard dog and she is no stranger to aggressive barking, but the dog's behavior on this night was unlike anything she had ever seen before. She says it was very intense. Her first thought was that there must be an intruder at the door trying to get inside to send her dog into such a frenzy. Scared that someone might be outside, she remembered that her cat was out there and thought maybe her cat was causing a stir. She knew that even if it was an intruder, her dog would kill to protect her. So she looked through the peephole but saw no one outside. She then opened the door to look for her cat. She expected her dog to go outside and sniff around, but instead the dog positioned herself between the OP and the open door and dug in, guarding her. Her vicious barking became even more aggressive than it previously had been. The OP again says she had never seen anything like it from her dog before. That's when she looked outside and saw what was out there. The first thing she says she noticed was this creature's eyes. They had a sheen to them like an animal at night and were glowing in the darkness. She then noticed the antlers and thought it was a deer until she realized that the face was at least 9 feet off the ground. Her eyes fell on this thing's body next and she could tell it had fur, but also that it was standing on 2 legs and hunched over like a human. A fear she had never known surged through her as she realized she was looking at something paranormal. She slammed her door and closed all the windows in her home, locked the doors, and hid under her sheets, she says, like a little kid. She could not fall asleep because every time she closed her eyes, she saw this creature. Unable to sleep, she decided to post her story online in hopes that someone could give her any information on what this thing could have been. She ends her post by saying she knows there is a debate on what a Wendigo looks like, that she is still terrified, and she would love some insight on her encounter. First and foremost, the OP's cat was fine. She says in the comments that the cat was in her backyard and was unbothered. There are some people in the comments saying that what she saw was a Wendigo, but the problem with that is Wendigo don't have antlers or fur. What the OP saw outside her home that night was most likely a Wechuge. As mentioned in the first story, Wechuge are almost always misidentified as a Wendigo. However, it is quite a different creature. I'm glad there was no further incident. This creature didn't rush the OP or her home when she opened the door. Maybe the vicious guard dog kept it away. But I'm sure that would be of no consolation for the sheer terror she felt when she spotted this thing. That's the stuff nightmares are made of. But she was able to make it out of her predicament without further incident, so hopefully this thing has moved on and will not bother her anymore. If she doesn't try to engage with the creature and ignores it should it try to engage with her, it should lose interest and do just that. What do you think she saw that night? And how fast would you slam the door and go hide if you saw something like that in front of your house? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who saw a creature outside his mother's house one night. He isn't exactly sure what he saw, so he posted his encounter online to see if anyone could help him identify what was out there that night. His encounter took place in Indiana between the years of 2009 and 2011. He does not say where exactly his mother's house is located. The OP was with his girlfriend at the time and his friend on the night of his encounter. His mother's cat was at the vet and she asked him to pick it up for her. Being that she lived out in the country and the vet was in town, the OP, his girlfriend, and his friend had a bit of a drive to retrieve the cat and drop it off at his mother's house. They arrived at the vet sometime between 4 and 5 o'clock, and being that it was winter, it was already starting to get dark out. They picked up the cat and made the drive out to his mother's house with the intention of going to see a movie afterward. By the time they arrived at his mother's house, the sun had all but set and it was cold out. The OP's friend went with him to take the cat inside, being that he wanted to say hey to his mother and chat with her for a minute. His girlfriend remained in the car and kept it running so it would stay warm. As the OP and his friend were walking up to the house, a weird feeling came over both of them. The OP says they figured out that they both felt the same thing when later discussing the events of the encounter. The feeling that came over them froze them in place with the big farmhouse in front of them. They both turned to face the sprawling yard only to see a huge figure. The OP says it was much taller than his friend, who stood at 6'3" and had a hulking shape to it. The top half of this creature had much more mass than did the bottom half, which he compares to a hunchback. He does say he couldn't really make out this being's legs because, as he puts it, they tapered off into the shadows. They could only make out a huge silhouette as this thing was shrouded in darkness. They saw no eyes or any discernible features other than the horns on top of this thing's head that looked more like antlers, and a mass on its back that looked lumpy and like it had irregular shapes sticking out of it. It was too dark for the OP to even venture a guess as to what that mass was, or what the shapes could have been sticking out of it. He did know two things for certain though. This creature was huge and it was very angry. The anger seemed to radiate off this thing, and the OP could somehow feel it, saying he got the feeling it was mad that they were there and it was staring directly at them. It did not make a sound as it stood and stared at them. The OP's friend finally snapped him out of his trance-like state and they ran inside his mother's house, delivered the cat, and waited for a while before going back out. After talking to his mother for a bit, they looked outside but didn't see anything, so they ran back to the car and his girlfriend stomped on the gas and got them out of there. He does mention in the comment section that his girlfriend did not see the creature and that she wasn't too happy being left outside once she found out what they saw. They never saw this creature again. He ends his post by giving some background information on his mother's house, saying that it has always been haunted. The house she lived in at the time was a newer one built on a spot where the old one burned down, killing a mother, her young son, and her older daughter. Friends who have stayed in the house report weird things happening to them, and the OP says he experienced weird things when he lived there too, but nothing like what happened that night. There are a lot of theories in the comments section as to what the OP saw that night, with people saying he saw a deer standing on its hind legs, which they are known to do from time to time, or that it was a moose. The OP clarifies that he grew up in Indiana and that no deer standing on his hind legs is taller than 6'3", and that there are no moose in the state. On the paranormal side, people guessed that this creature could have been a demon, a shadow person, a skinwalker, or a Wendigo. Most people in the comments, as well as the OP, correctly point out that Wendigo do not have antlers. If I were to venture a guess as to what the OP saw outside his mother's house that night, I would say it could have been a Wechuge. They are usually described as tall, hulking beasts that do have antlers. If the house is haunted and there is a lot of activity in and around it, it could be drawn to the spot because of the activity there. It is not unheard of to have cryptids and paranormal activity happening in the same area or on the same property. They all seem to either be linked together or drawn to places like the mother's house in this story. Cryptids seem to feed off dark energy and negative feelings, so it would make sense for it to be hanging around the house and that property. In any case, I'm glad they never had the misfortune of running into this creature again, whatever it was, and the OP does say his mother no longer lives in that house. What do you think the OP and his friends saw that night? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.